Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a really compelling exploration ahead for you today.
We really do.
Yeah, and to start, I want you to consider a rather vivid scenario. Just imagine a historical document predicting the exact name of a global ruler.
Right.
And not just his name, but his specific foreign policy decisions and his military strategies. And here is the kicker. A full 150 years before that individual is even born.
It sounds like science fiction.
It does. I mean, is an anomaly like that simply a statistical outlier? Like a phenomenally lucky guess? Or is it evidence of something operating entirely outside our conventional understanding of space and time?
It is a profound question, and it really sits right at the center of the architecture we are analyzing today.
Exactly. So today we are exploring source material from Erwin W. Lutzer's book, 7 Reasons Why You Can Trust the Bible.
And our mission in this deep dive is to systematically unpack the multifaceted arguments presented in this text. I mean, these are arguments that synthesize fields ranging from ancient archaeology to textual criticism all the way to modern astrophysics. It covers a lot of ground.
It really does. And the overarching case Lutzer is making is that the Bible functions as a historically and logically reliable document.
Right. But before we begin dissecting these arguments, it is so crucial to establish the parameters of this discussion for you, the listener.
Absolutely. We need to be clear about this.
Yes, because the source material we are covering today navigates content that is intrinsically charged. It intersects with deeply held political, philosophical, and religious convictions.
It definitely doesn't shy away from controversy.
It doesn't. The book explicitly critiques secularism, and it directly challenges the frameworks of prominent atheist thinkers, people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris.
So we want to state unequivocally right here at the start that our role is strictly analytical.
Yes. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the theological viewpoints of the author, nor are we endorsing the counter-arguments of his critics. Our objective is just to impartially report on the framework of these arguments. We want to convey the complex ideas contained in the original text so that you can critically evaluate these multiple perspectives for yourself.
Right. That is the perfect lens through which to view this material. So what is the logical entry point here?
Well, a good place to start is the cultural and philosophical baseline the book establishes. Lutzer argues that modern and particularly postmodern society operates on a strict bifurcation between facts and values.
Right, the whole facts versus values divide.
Exactly. It's a divide popularized by 19th century thinkers, notably T.H. Huxley. The prevailing cultural framework categorizes science, mathematics, and documented history as objective facts.
Which makes sense to most people today.
It does. But conversely, religion, spirituality, and morality are relegated to the subjective realm. They are treated as personal values or psychological preferences, not empirical realities.
And the cultural byproduct of that divide is that very familiar sentiment of, you have your truth and I have mine, so long as it works for you. However, the source material fundamentally rejects that dichotomy. The premise here is that biblical faith was never intended to be a purely internal subjective experience. It claims to be tethered to actual, verifiable historical events.
Which naturally surfaces one of the primary friction points when analyzing the text, the tension of human error.
Yes, because critics will often point out that a document compiled by dozens of fallible humans over millennia. I mean, how can that logically be classified as flawless or divine?
It's a huge question. How does the conceptual framework of the book reconcile that specific tension?
Well, it addresses that tension through a theological concept termed dual authorship.
Dual authorship.
Right. And the book is very careful to distinguish this from passive dictation. It argues that the divine element did not simply treat the human writers as stenographers, just taking rote shorthand.
Because if that were the case, the text would read with a single uniform voice.
Exactly. Instead, the concept suggests a superintending process. You had roughly 40 different authors, but they utilized their own distinct vocabularies, grammatical structures, and investigative methods.
No, like the Gospel of Luke.
Yes, Luke is a perfect example. The text opens with the author, who is a physician, explicitly stating he engaged in careful, systematic historical investigation before compiling his account.
So they weren't just in a trance writing things down.
Right. And Lutzer uses a really helpful analogy to illustrate how this dual mechanism theoretically functions. Imagine a scenario where a teacher receives a letter written directly by the President of the United States.
Okay.
She instructs her students to hand copy this letter into their personal notebooks. Over time, the original document is lost. Now the teacher has to reconstruct the president's exact message, relying solely on the students' copies.
And obviously kids are going to make mistakes.
Right. One notebook might have a misspelled word, another might feature a misplaced comma. Yet through textual comparison, the core original message remains completely intact and verifiable.
I see. So the underlying assertion is that human mechanics do not inherently negate the integrity of the original communication.
Exactly. It is a really effective way to conceptualize the field of textual criticism. The argument posits that fallible human agents are capable of recording infallible statements.
So the minor variations found across thousands of ancient manuscript copies do not, according to this framework, degrade the architectural integrity of the core message.
Right. So moving from the theoretical construction of the text to its physical footprint, the source material transitions into historical and archaeological claims.
This is where we get into the minimalist challenge, right?
Yes. This refers to a school of historical skepticism that basically defaults to rejecting the existence of biblical figures, people like Moses or King David.
Or even specific historical events.
Exactly. They reject them unless there is independent, secular archaeological data corroborating them.
And to counter that skepticism, Lutzer employs a really fascinating epistemological argument drawn directly from the narrative of the text itself. Specifically, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2.
The story of the paralyzed man.
Right. In this account, Jesus encounters a paralyzed man and tells him that his sins are forgiven. The religious authorities present view this as blasphemy.
Sure, because only God can forgive sins.
Exactly. So in response, Jesus poses a specific logical challenge. He asks, which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say get up and walk?
It is a brilliant rhetorical maneuver because it forces a falsifiable test. I mean, from an empirical standpoint, it is infinitely easier to just claim your sins are forgiven.
Because it's invisible.
Right, it's an invisible metaphysical assertion. No observer can visually verify or falsify the evaporation of sin. However, commanding a paralyzed man to walk is a visible physical claim. It has immediate, undeniable consequences if it fails.
Exactly the point Lutzer is making. By performing the visible earthly miracle of healing the paralysis, the narrative attempts to validate the invisible heavenly authority to forgive sins.
And the book scales this logic up to a macro level.
It does. The assertion is that the text's historical and earthly claims must be historically verifiable if the reader is to place any intellectual trust in its spiritual or heavenly claims. The epistemology of the text binds the theology inextricably to the history.
Which brings us to the archaeological data presented to support that history. The source material outlines several instances where prevailing academic consensus assumed the biblical narrative was mythological, only to be later revised by archaeological discoveries.
The Hittite Empire is a prime example of this.
Yes. For generations, critics maintained that the Hittites were just a biblical fiction. There was a complete absence of secular historical records.
Until 1911.
Right. That consensus held until 1911, when an archaeologist named Hugo Winkler excavated a site at Bogazkoy and unearthed an archive of 10,000 clay tablets. He effectively revealed the ancient capital of the Hittite Empire.
It's a striking example of an absence of evidence not equating to evidence of absence. Lutzer utilizes these archaeological shifts to argue for a pattern of historical reliability.
And another cornerstone of this argument is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947.
Found by a Bedouin shepherd, right?
Yeah, hidden in caves in the Judean hills for 2 millennia. These manuscripts date back to roughly 140 BC, which pushed the timeline of available Hebrew texts back a full 1,000 years earlier than the previously oldest known manuscripts.
A 1,000-year gap presents a massive variable in textual transmission.
Huge. The natural assumption would be that a document subjected to a millennium of manual hand copying would mutate significantly. You'd think it would potentially alter the core narratives.
That is the logical assumption, but the comparative analysis yielded a very different result. When scholars analyzed the Book of Isaiah found in the Qumran caves against the modern Masoretic Hebrew texts, they found a 95% identical match.
95%.
After
1,000 years.
Yeah. And the text emphasizes that the remaining 5% divergence consisted almost entirely of minor spelling variations and obvious scribal slips of the pen.
So none of it altered the substantive meaning of the text.
Exactly. The argument here is that this level of preservation across a millennium is an anomaly that lends severe credibility to the text's transmission process.
So if archaeology and textual criticism ground the document in the past, the source material also insists that the text stakes its credibility on predicting the future.
Right, the prophecy test section.
Yes, the text draws a sharp literary contrast here. It contrasts biblical prophecy with the kind of vague predictions often associated with historical seers, like Nostradamus.
Right, picture Nostradamus sitting on a brass tripod over steaming water, writing vague, scrambled riddles.
Exactly. The mechanics of a figure like Nostradamus rely heavily on ambiguity. The predictions are often multilingual riddles that require post hoc rationalization. People continually reinterpret a vague reference like trying to twist a river named Ister into a prediction about Hitler.
Lutzer argues that this methodology is successful precisely because it lacks specificity. It contrasts sharply with biblical prophecy, which he characterizes as specific, literal, and historically measurable.
And the premier example offered is the prophet Isaiah's prediction regarding King Cyrus of Persia.
The timeline of this specific claim is what makes it a focal point of the book. Isaiah predicts the geopolitical fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, followed by the subsequent conquest of Babylon by Persia.
And he names names.
He does. The text specifically names the future Persian king, Cyrus. It even details his foreign policy directive that he will issue a decree to free the captive Jewish population and finance the rebuilding of Jerusalem.
And the catch is, the text asserts that this was recorded roughly a century and a half before Cyrus was even born.
Right. And the historical record confirms the timeline of the events themselves. Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC and issued the Decree of Liberation shortly thereafter.
So by highlighting the specificity of naming the monarch and detailing his geopolitical strategies centuries in advance, the book argues that this level of predictive data surpasses human cognitive capacity. It points toward a source operating independent of linear time.
Another really complex historical anomaly presented is the military prophecy regarding the coastal city of Tyre.
Oh, this one is a gripping piece of military history. The prophet Ezekiel recorded a remarkably detailed sequence of events. He predicted that Tyre would face a coalition of nations, its structural walls would be dismantled, and the very rubble, timber, and dust of the city would be stripped bare and cast into the sea.
Leaving a flat rock suitable only for spreading fishnets? It is oddly specific.
Very. And the fulfillment of that sequence is wild. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon initially laid siege to the mainland city of Tyre. He destroyed the mainland infrastructure, but the population successfully relocated to a heavily fortified island situated half a mile off the coast.
And Nebuchadnezzar lacked the naval capacity to conquer the island.
Right, so he leaves, leaving the prophecy seemingly incomplete for over 2 centuries.
But then the resolution arrives with Alexander the Great's military campaign.
Yes. 240 years later, Alexander needed to neutralize the island fortress of Tyre, but similarly lacked an immediate naval fleet.
So what does he do?
His strategic solution was to construct a half-mile causeway from the mainland to the island. And to source the building materials for this massive engineering project, his army systematically dismantled the ruins of the old mainland city.
They literally scraped the stones, timber, and dirt.
They scraped it bare and threw it into the Mediterranean to build the land bridge. He also commandeered ships from several conquered territories to aid the siege, perfectly fulfilling that multi-nation detail.
And the source material points out that the ancient site today mirrors the exact physical description recorded by Ezekiel, a scraped rock utilized by local fishermen.
It's incredible. The author uses these historical intersections to pose a direct epistemological question to the reader. How does a skeptical framework account for that degree of precise, sequential historical accuracy recorded centuries prior to the events?
Lutzer posits that these are not coincidences, but verifiable markers of divine origin.
And all of these macro-level historical and prophetic arguments ultimately converge on a single figure in the narrative, Jesus of Nazareth.
Which brings us to the book's critique of the modern academic movement known as the Jesus Seminar.
Yes, the Jesus Seminar. This was a collaborative group of scholars who utilized a voting system. They literally dropped colored beads into a receptacle to determine the historical authenticity of the quotes attributed to Jesus in the Gospels.
Red for definitely Jesus, black for definitely not.
Exactly. And their methodology resulted in the conclusion that only about 18% of the recorded words were authentic. Their overarching goal was to strip away the supernatural elements to isolate a purely historical human moral teacher.
But the source material finds the underlying methodology of the Jesus Seminar to be fundamentally flawed. Lutzer argues these scholars were largely operating from an a priori assumption that supernatural events just cannot occur.
So any textual reference to a miracle must, by their definition, be a later embellishment.
Right. And Lutzer counters this using a vivid analogy of an art restoration firm. Imagine a firm hired to clean a priceless watercolor painting, but they apply a chemical solvent that dissolves the paint entirely, ruining the artwork. The argument is that attempting to chemically separate the moral philosopher from the miraculous claims is a destructive solvent. The biblical portrait of Christ is inextricably woven as a single narrative cloth. Removing the divine claims fundamentally unravels the historical portrait they are actually trying to save.
This naturally invites the counter-argument so often raised by skeptics. Is it not highly probable that the disciples simply invented the miraculous elements, to elevate their teacher and initiate a new religious movement?
Lutzer addresses this by analyzing the cultural and psychological environment of first-century Judea. He gives two primary reasons why fabricating this specific narrative was highly improbable.
Okay, what is the first reason?
First, the cultural expectation for the Messiah was inherently militaristic and political. The Jewish population anticipated a conquering military hero who would violently crush the Roman occupation.
They wanted their national sovereignty restored.
Exactly. The figure of Jesus, a suffering servant who was ultimately executed via crucifixion, was the total opposite of their cultural and political expectations.
Okay, and the second reason?
The second reason delves into the theological psychology of the disciples themselves. They were raised as strict Jewish monotheists. In their paradigm, the ultimate transgression, the most severe sin, was idolatry, the act of elevating a created human being to the status of God.
That is a massive psychological barrier.
It is. The text argues they were psychologically incapable of deifying a mere mortal. The premise is that the disciples lacked the capacity to spontaneously invent a narrative where a crucified carpenter was worshipped as the creator.
Right.
Lutzer contends that only an undeniable empirical event, specifically the physical resurrection, could have possessed the required force to shatter their monotheistic framework and convince them to worship him. Absent that event, the logical historical outcome would have been the immediate dissolution of the movement.
The book also examines how Jesus himself viewed the foundational source material. It notes that Jesus systematically affirmed the historical accuracy of the Old Testament narratives, even the ones modern readers find most scientifically contentious.
Right. He referenced Adam and Eve as literal historical figures. He affirmed the reality of Noah's flood and utilized the narrative of Jonah surviving inside the great fish.
He affirmed the text down to the smallest letter or stroke.
So Lutzer is drawing a line of theological consistency here. The argument is that one cannot logically revere Jesus as a profound moral authority while simultaneously dismissing his explicit endorsement of the Hebrew Scriptures.
Now, beyond the historical and the textual, the source material scales all the way back to the cosmological.
Yes, the intersection of the Bible and science.
There's often an assumed inherent friction between biblical texts and modern science. However, Lutzer argues that the very first sentence of the text, Genesis 1:1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," actually constructs the necessary philosophical foundation for scientific inquiry.
He claims that those 10 words systematically dismantle 4 major alternative worldviews.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that claim.
Okay, well, the book asserts that Genesis 1:1 refutes atheism by immediately positing an active creator. It refutes pantheism, the belief that the universe itself is the divine entity, by establishing that the creator exists independently and prior to the creation.
Right.
It refutes polytheism by attributing creation to a singular unified source. And finally, it refutes materialism, the philosophical stance that physical matter is the only reality and has existed eternally, by declaring that matter had a definitive temporal starting point.
And that concept of a definitive starting point aligns surprisingly well with modern astrophysics. For centuries, the prevailing scientific model assumed a steady-state eternal universe.
Right.
But the development of the Big Bang Theory, championed by modern scientists like Stephen Hawking and Carl Sagan, established that the universe had a singular beginning. The source material leverages this consensus. If there is a beginning, it invites the concept of a creator, because matter cannot spontaneously create itself from nothing.
Furthermore, the text heavily emphasizes the concept of cosmological fine-tuning. The margins required for a life-sustaining universe are infinitesimally narrow.
The scientific quotes in this section are staggering. The book cites Stephen Hawking, who observed that if the rate of the universe's expansion just 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million.
1 part in 100,000 million.
Yeah, the universe would have collapsed back upon itself before planetary formation was possible. It also references physicist Joel Premack, who noted that humans seem to have hit the jackpot in a cosmic Las Vegas.
And Lutzer analyzes this data and concludes that this staggering degree of fine-tuning transcends statistical probability or blind cosmic luck. He argues this empirical precision points to divine providence.
An intelligent designer who intentionally calibrated the physics of the universe.
Exactly. So to recap the overarching narrative we've explored today, Lutzer weaves together a really comprehensive, multidisciplinary defense.
He does. He utilizes archaeological excavations to validate ancient geopolitical records. He analyzes the statistical anomalies of fulfilled historical prophecies.
He examines the psychological barriers to inventing a divine messiah, and he aligns ancient cosmological claims with modern astrophysics.
The total sum of these arguments is presented as a rational foundation for viewing the Bible as a cohesive, reliable document. And returning to our mission for you, the listener, our objective has been to present these fascinating arguments so you can evaluate the evidence for yourself.
Yes. And as we conclude, there's one final, intriguing nugget from the source material that we haven't discussed yet.
Oh, the Bible code.
Yes. Lutzer describes how some modern researchers use complex computer algorithms to skip thousands of letters in the Hebrew text to find hidden messages. Things like predicting the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin.
It's the idea that the text functions as a mathematical cipher.
Right, hiding secret data beneath the surface narrative. But interestingly, Lutzer categorically rejects the validity of the Bible code.
Really? Even though he defends the supernatural origin of the text?
Yes. He argues that God doesn't hide secret messages for 20th century supercomputers to find. Within his framework, true revelation is plain, clear, and meant for all generations to understand.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating observation to ponder as we close. Why is human nature so eager to search for secret, magical codes and ciphers, while simultaneously trying so hard to ignore or deconstruct the plain, demanding moral and historical text sitting right in front of us?
It reveals quite a bit about how we process truth.
It really does. Something to think about as you continue your own journey of learning. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.